Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we're going to get into moving in together. And I'm going to start this episode a little bit differently. This is something that's been on my mind recently, and that's the importance of, when appropriate, separating your morals from research. So I am open and honest about my religious beliefs. Now, on the podcast, we tend to avoid politics and religion.
Right.
They definitely can have an effect on mental health, but we tend to avoid those.
I think it's important to say, I don't think we avoid them because you and I are very different. You know, we have different thoughts on both of those things. But I think it's more maybe out of respect for our listeners that, and we really hard. I mean, it would be impossible for us to know where our listeners fall, in that. And so I think that's one of probably the main reason that we avoid it.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, we want this podcast to apply to everybody. I mean, that's really what it comes down to is,
right.
We want this to be applicable. I mean, our goal is to help people with mental health, and people will struggle with mental health, religious, non-religious, no matter what side of the political aisle. I mean, mental health is non-discriminate. It will affect everybody. So the point that I'm trying to make is that it's okay if your beliefs are different than what research shows. And I'll explain that a little bit more in a minute, but I think that it's important to, when appropriate, set your morals aside and to be able to look at things in an unbiased way and to look at something objectively. Now, you can still believe in something, you can still hold to your values, you can still hold to your morals, even if research and data don't support it. It's okay to do both. And so the reason I bring this up is I am in school and I'm attending a religious school that is a very big proponent of marriage. They're very big into sponsoring marriage. So as we're going to get into tonight's topic, this is something that I have studied about in school, but I have studied it through the lens of religion and why it is important to facilitate marriage. What I have been studying is that there is a lower chance of divorce if you wait until you are married before you move in together. Now, I recognize that I'm viewing this through the lens of religion and a religious school who wants to promote marriage. And I can believe that. I can believe in waiting until you are married before you live together. And I can also see and recognize, and it's important to see and recognize that not everybody is going to agree with that. And it's okay. And as I get into the world of psychology, I am sure that I'm going to treat clients and have patients who are going to have different moral beliefs. And I can still validate their beliefs and validate their morals without compromising my own.
Right. I agree with that.
And so I get into that because I know that this is something that we've talked about before, Mark. And so I wanted to get your take on this because I know that your take is different. It's more about the commitment rather than actual, like the piece of paper, rather than marriage. Because to many people, marriage is just a piece of paper.
So I think generally when we talk about research, I think I've talked about research before. I think you have to be pretty careful just because statistics are easily manipulated. And this is with any research, I think, that if you set out with a particular goal, you can take a lot of research and manipulate the statistics and so that it shows, it supports what you want it to support. So I'll talk specifically about marriage research that comes out of BYU, and it's mentioned in, they're cited in a lot of different places on the research around commitment and marriage. And there's a big problem with all the research, I think, on this subject. And I think it's true, the research that comes out of BYU. And let me try and explain what this is. So if you have the reason for moving in, and you can have what we have it be relationship driven or you can have it be event driven. And so
Okay.
relationship driven would be more, we're committed, they may even be on their way to marriage, but it's more about they've been thoughtful about it and they've made a joint decision to go ahead and move in. Now, event driven is very different in that event driven would be, okay, the woman got pregnant. They weren't counting on it. So we better get married. We better move in. That's event driven. I want to save money on rent. One of us is being, I have to find a new place to live. Well, why don't you just come and live with me? And that's event driven. And so if you separate those two, when they do the research, they combine them.
Okay.
And so there is no distinction between the choices if the people went into cohabitating because it was relationship driven or event driven. Now, I'm going to say I truly believe that if it's event driven, your chance of divorce is higher than if you're married. That event driven, moving into together because it's event driven, does not work very well.
Yeah.
But I think it's pretty clear to me that if you were to separate the research, that if you only talk to the people who were relationship driven, that you'd probably find very similar levels of happiness and marital and success compared to if you were married. Now, this commitment research there's a guy out of the University of Denver, and I can't remember what his name is, and he wrote a book on it. And so, that's the big difference. And so my complaint about all research, not just the research that comes out of Brigham Young University, is that they lump them all together. Okay. And so I don't think you're getting an accurate view. But so what you said, that where the research shows that moving in, it's not as successful. I think that's true based on how they did the research.
Okay, right.
But if I wanted to get a better view of what's happening, I'd separate them, which is pretty easy to do. If you're taking a survey anyway, you just ask them how it was that they decided to move in together. What is clear, though, is that moving in together is more common now, certainly, than it used to be. Statistics, when you look back, the latest statistics I could find on this were in 2018, which is, that's, 5 years ago. And so, and this comes from the Census Bureau because they ask questions like this. And so for the age group 25 to 34, it increased 12% from a decade before 2018. And the percentage of 25 to 34-year-olds who are married continues to decline. Whereas, back in 1978, 59% of the 25 to 34-year-olds were married, but only 30% are married in 2018. So it's becoming more accepted, I think, and normal to move in. But I think the reason you and I wanted to do this episode, I think, is to make that distinction between event-driven and relationship-driven. But it's true that married individuals, like if you compare married individuals compared to those who are just living together, and again, that combines everybody, in that group, they're 12% more likely to report, the married individuals are 12% more likely to report being in high relationship satisfaction, 26 percentage points more likely to report being in the highest stability group. So they see it as being more stable, which I certainly believe, because I think if you're living together because it's event driven, I think that's really unstable. I think it's incredibly unstable. So here I'm giving my takeaway at the start of our session, but I think the one takeaway is really think about the reason you're moving in. So are you familiar with the difference between a qualitative study and a quantitative study?
Vaguely.
Yeah, qualitative study is more you're talking about people and having them tell their stories. And then there's a whole way that you separate the data that you get so that you can come up with some conclusions. But what's interesting about the qualitative study on the reason people move in together is the vast majority of them don't even think about it. They just say it happened. I mean, I don't know why anyone would make such a huge decision.
Yeah.
And not really talk about it. They just slide into cohabitation, and that definitely puts couples at risk for later distress.
Right.
What they found in that qualitative study is you lack this foundation of commitment. It goes back and so the research in some ways supports what I'm saying, that if you move in for the right reason, for the relationship reason, then your success is just the same as if you got married. If you move in for event driven, I it's not good. It doesn't look good. It really doesn't. It's unstable. You lack commitment. It's too easy to pick up and leave.
And that's part of the problem too, is the fact that, well, it's too easy to leave, but it's also not easy to leave once you move in together. It's harder. You're much more entangled. You're much more enmeshed. So another thing that I think is interesting that research has also shown is that, or well, I don't know if this is even research. This is just data. This is just fact, that the age of marriage is a lot higher than it was. There's been a very sharp incline in the average age of first marriage. And it used to be something like, I think 22 or 23, I think even just like 50 years ago. And now it's up to like, I think 27 for women and 29 for males. And it's also more unusual to not live together before you're married.
Right.
Outside of religious circles. In fact, it's considered by many people irresponsible to not live, at least culturally. That's an anomaly. Like, oh, you didn't live together? Like, how do you know if you're a good fit? How do you know if you're compatible until you live together before you get married? It's almost like you start dating, you move in together, you get engaged, and then you get married. That kind of seems the succession of relationships nowadays.
It's 67% on, at least, back in 67% of currently married adults report that they live together with their current partner before getting married. And so you're right, it's much more accepted. And so we're putting those moral issues or the religious issues aside. But I think even in the religious world, at least I think I saw this about the statistics in Utah, that the age of marriage is going up here as well. And I think some of that might have to do with economic. I think that, that people if you can't move out of your parents' home and live individually, it's going to be really hard to move out of your parents' home and get married and, get an apartment or a house together. And so I think that the economic situation currently makes it difficult to get married, for instance, in the LDS culture, right off of your mission or right out of school. I think a lot of people want to start a career and get some money saved up, which makes sense. But I think that's one of the reasons that marriage is being pushed off.
And even on a national level, I think a big reason is people consider it just as irresponsible to get married while you're still in college as they do to get married before you live together. So that is also a cultural thing. It's culturally acceptable to wait until you are out of school before you get married. And, I certainly understand that college is a time for frugality, and you're supposed to be focused on your studies. That can certainly make relationships hard. I'd be really interested to see what research shows on marriages that start in college, like couples who get married in college, and how well their relationship fares compared to people who waited until after college. That'd be interesting.
Right. And I mean, I got married in college.
So did I.
47 years. But I wish I had kept this research. Utah, the governor used to have a whole commission on marriage, which I thought was a really good idea. And they used to have a yearly conference that was pretty good. And they'd bring in people like Gottman to talk to therapists and to couples. But they put out some statistics, and here's what I remember from that what they were showing is that your chance of having a successful marriage go up with a couple of things. One is if you come from a family where there's no divorce, if you wait till after college to get married, if you're older when you get married. So all of these things, at least from years ago from the Utah perspective, really showed that you increase the likelihood of a successful marriage if you wait.
Which, again, is generally true, but not always. I mean, I was 19 when I got married, and 12 years in, I couldn't be happier. I think one of the reasons why it worked so well for Curtis and I is we both wanted the same things, right? So we were both looking for somebody who made religion the center of their lives. That was important to us. And then we also knew we wanted kids. We knew we wanted me to be a stay-at-home mom. We wanted him to have a career. And so I think that's a big reason of our success is we both wanted the same things. And so as your relationship is progressing, those are important conversations to have. And it's going to come up eventually. So I'm just going to bring it up now because it makes sense. And that's Robin Smith's Lies at the Altar. and the 276 questions to ask before you get married. So those are good things to discuss before you get married, and then maybe even start discussing as you start moving in together. So I want to talk about the hormonal component that is going on in a new relationship because it's important.
Okay.
Okay.
It influences a lot. Yeah.
It really does. So I heard this referred to once as a relationship DUI because
I like that.
yes, I mean, because all these hormones are surging, you're so happy and you think it's great, you think this is the best person ever, and you tend to make irresponsible decisions based on
Yeah.
all of these hormones. And so,
Right.
things seem to go too fast.
Yeah.
Now, I want to note that I was probably in a relationship DUI myself. I mean, I met Curtis in January. We started dating in April. We got engaged in June and married in October. So
That's
that
pretty fast, Liz.
that was a very fast timeline. So I'm going to
uh,
own my hypocrisy here. Okay. But I can also say that it was a good decision because 12 years later, we're still really happy. But it
right.
is important to talk about these things because there is a major hormonal component going on,
Mm-hmm.
and it can cause people to think moving in together is a really good idea when it's not, because the relationship maybe isn't there.
Right. And I think that this is where we separate, say, religious beliefs, because I think a lot of religious beliefs would say that you shouldn't have sex before married. That then, I think, increases the pressure for some couples to say, let's get married. I mean, they don't say this, but
Yeah.
I think in the back of their minds, let's get married so that we can have sex.
Mm-hmm.
And so, one of the things that happens if you aren't in a religious tradition that says that is then you can go ahead and have sex and you don't necessarily have to get married in order
Mm-hmm.
to do that. I think we all, I mean, I call it the bump. I think I've explained that, where your hormones go up
Mm-hmm.
in any new relationship, and they stay that way anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. So I think we're all in that relationship DUI at some point.
Yeah.
And so the important thing that for some reason I have these terms due diligence, which I think is a financial term, like if you're doing a business deal, you do your due diligence, which
Yeah.
essentially means you're asking those 276 questions so that
Mm-hmm.
you have all the information. And so I think in any relationship, you're going to have that new relationship. You'll have that relationship DUI, but you've got to slow down and ask the questions. And this doesn't matter whether you're in a religious tradition where you don't have sex or where you do. I think it's equally important either
Yeah.
way is that you take the time to really get to know the other person.
Yeah.
And don't get married because you think, oh, it's the next step. Or I hear all sorts of reasons, couples who are 10 years in and they're having terrible marital difficulties. And I'll ask them, one or the other, did you know this when you got married? And the answer is almost always yes. When I say this, it's whatever the problem is.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always surprising to me how many people say, yeah, I knew it. And they think either it'll change or that it won't matter or that I love this person enough that, we'll work it out. And that's just not the case. I think that
Yeah.
you have to go in doing your due diligence and getting all the information and then make a conscious decision, either to move in together or to get married, not just based on that you love the other person,
Yeah.
but you've got to have the heart and the brain in there. You've got
Mm-hmm.
to make a logical decision. Is this going to work? Because I think that our species, I think we have this incredible ability to love other
Mm-hmm.
people.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean we can have a successful relationship with them.
Yeah.
We can love them, but it doesn't mean it will work.
And one thing that you've said before that I've always liked is it's not about love, it's about behavior.
It's about behavior, yeah.
And, so you can love somebody, but that doesn't mean that their behavior is going to be compatible with your lifestyle.
Right.
And so these are important conversations to have and important things to consider before you jump in feet first. And I think
it won't be surprising to you how many times I've heard we talk about behavior and the other person says, oh, but I love him or her so much.
Yeah.
And it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. It's all about behavior.
Yeah. And so you've got to make sure you're compatible, maybe even have a good fight or two or a good disagreement. right? I mean, find out how you handle conflict.
Right.
So, one thing that I do want to say in terms of behavior that I have seen quite regularly is pay attention to the way your significant other treats their family members,
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
in general.
And
So,
friends.
and friends, but
And wait staff in restaurants.
and wait staff in restaurants, yes. Okay, so but because the reason I bring up family is because the way your significant other treats their family is eventually the way they're going to treat you. Because when you first fall in love, it's nothing but kindness, and that's your favorite person. You're not ever going to say anything untoward towards them. But 5 years down the road, they're going to be just as comfortable with you as they are with your family. So the way they interact with their family, and I'm talking about on a regular, like normal basis.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not talking about, they get into a fight with a member of their family, or there's some heat, or like if there's conflict between a family member. But I mean, that is important to pay attention to. I guess, no, I guess what I'm saying is that is important too, is how do they handle conflict with their family? Because that's eventually the way that they are going to handle conflict with you, and it's the way they're going to treat you.
And I want to add one other thing to pay attention to.
Mm-hmm.
When you go to your partner's family, pay really close attention how his or her parents treat each other. Because that is a really good indicator as well as future behavior, because that's what we call social learning. And so that's what that person was brought up seeing. And often it's the way they then enter the marriage. Is they learned how to behave toward a spouse from watching their own parents. And so I think it's really important to, look at the parents and pay attention. Do they treat each other respectfully? Mm-hmm. And if they don't, then I think you need to be very careful.
Or at least have a conversation. Mm-hmm. Because I will say my parents, and again, I love my parents and I have a very good relationship with my parents. They have a history of poor treatment of each other, and it's mutual. And so I have broke that cycle, and Curtis has also broke that cycle because he certainly did not have a good example of a healthy marriage. So you can overcome it. And
yes, you can.
If you notice it, I think it's a conversation you need to discuss. You need to say, hey, we both, one or both of us has this, or we have this learned behavior or the social learning of, not treating your spouse very well. What are we going to do differently so that doesn't become an issue for us?
Right. But see, again, it's part of what I'm calling that relationship due diligence is you really need to dive into it. You can't ignore it. I think it's a mistake to ignore those things we call those red flags. To me, that would be one of those red flags. So don't ignore the red flags. Now, it doesn't mean you end the relationship. It does mean you have a discussion about it and you have a plan on how you're going to have your own relationship moving forward. So you have to address, at the very least, you have to address the red flags.
Right. The red flags mean a conversation. Now, there are certain red flags that you should turn tail and run, right? Any sign of
abuse. Things like that. Abuse, I wouldn't stick around at all. For emotional abuse or physical abuse.
Yeah, or verbal abuse.
Right.
Okay, so let's talk a minute about this idea of let's do a test run of living together to see if we're a good fit. Now, can we still apply that to, is this relationship driven or is this convenience driven? So what are your thoughts on test run, testing out living together just to see if we're a good fit?
Well, are you talking about a test run as far as I still keep my place? I'll have my place, you have your place? Or is this a different situation? Because I think I don't care what you call it. I mean, if you call it a test run, I'd say that's event driven rather than relationship driven. I think that for me, it being relationship driven is we really love each other. We're good together. And, we're planning for most couples, they're planning on getting married, but that you don't have to. But, they're saying we want to plan the marriage a couple of years down the road, but this is our intent. Mm-hmm. That's relationship driven. If you're saying let's do a test run, I think that's event driven.
Okay.
I think that's a bad idea, personally.
Now, so now there could be a way to do a test run, but it's what I call half living together is kind of the way I described it. So you want to see if you guys are a good fit. Now, I think that could potentially be a good idea. But if you're going to do that, you need to have an out if it's not going to work, right? So this half living together, you each still have your own separate place, but maybe you're spending half the time, you have a drawer at their place, or, you keep a lot of your essentials from home there, right? And so that I think could be a good alternative to, we want to test this out. We're going
Well,
to.
I agree. I think you're
Okay.
right. I think
Okay.
that could be a really good alternative. And the reason is the out is I still have my own place.
Yeah.
And so if something happens, see, I think part of the problem, you move in together and it's event driven, it's really hard to then find another place. I mean,
Yep.
it's just problematic. But if you have your place anyway, and then you can say, you know what, this isn't working, or I need some space or something. And you can, just stop coming over or empty the drawer, and you haven't moved all of your stuff from your place to the other, to your partner's house. It's just easier to disconnect. And so I think you can get more information.
Yeah.
If you don't have those religious or moral constraints, then I think that could be a good option.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So I do want to address something in terms of religion. And I want to acknowledge that there are kind of two sides to this morals of waiting until marriage to have sex, right? So it does cause people to prematurely get married, or for relationships to kind of go on fast track.
Right.
But I do also want to, and I want to acknowledge that is can potentially be problematic, because you might find that you might not have waited long enough. But I also want to acknowledge that typically in religion, most religions place a high value on marriage. And so often there is greater levels of commitment. So, there is both. So, it can be problematic, but it can also work well, because I want to say that there's statistics, or maybe I may be remembering this wrong, but is the divorce rate lower in religions? Am I remembering this right?
That's a good question. I wish I could answer that. I don't have an answer for it. I'm going to guess yes.
Okay. Yeah. So, there's two sides.
It's not just the divorce rate, because I would want to say, is marital happiness different?
That's a good point. That is
And so if you're unhappy, but you feel like you don't have the option to get in a divorce, is that better or worse? Because you're in a religious tradition that really frowns on divorce. And so you stay in an unhappy marriage that may not be good for you. It may not be good for the kids.
Right.
And so it's more complicated. It's really complicated issue than just saying divorce rate might be lower in people who are religious. I would guess that's probably true. I don't know about the happiness level though.
Okay. Yeah, or what you might call marital satisfaction is still. And that is an important component to being married, is marital satisfaction. Is, are you happy? Are you satisfied with your life? Because especially if you have kids, and that's really where it gets complicated. And so one last thing that I want to bring up is, Mark, we both believe that relationships are what make us happy.
Yes.
And in particular, long-term committed relationships.
Yes.
Right?
That's right. I agree.
And so, whether or not you're a believer of marriage, and no matter how you think of it, I think that family as a social structure is important. Family does matter. And I'm talking in terms of when you have kids. And I'm not saying that there should never be a divorce, but I think once you have kids together, I think it is so important to focus on how do we have a happy, satisfied, healthy life together, whatever that looks like, married or unmarried. That matters, because healthy families will create healthy children in general, right?
No, I agree with that 100%. And that's why, for me, it just makes it all the more important to do your due diligence first.
Yeah.
And I say this sometimes I'll see couples who are, newlywed or thinking of getting married, or, they're engaged. And what I try and help them see is you can't just view each other with that lens that you see each other now as singles. And I'll ask them, because some people, are planning not to have children, but, the vast majority of couples are going to have children. And so I say, I want you to imagine each other as parents.
Yeah.
And so you have to put yourself in a different situation. And that's true, say, for substance use. Like if you're just a couple and you're married, cannabis use might be okay. And what I try and help them see are alcohol use. It's going to change as soon as you have kids, guaranteed.
Yep.
You're going to think differently about it. And so you have to do use some foresight in thinking, okay, what will this look like 10 years down the road when we have children? What kind of parent will this guy be? What kind of mother will this woman be? And so I think, again, it's one of the part of the questions. I think, in Robin Smith's book, I'm pretty sure there's a section that talks about family and attitudes, towards children and things like that. And I think you need to talk about it and really think about it. And so you're right. I think family is important. Once you have children, I think the focus a lot should be on the kids and raising, healthy, happy kids. But couples, I think, should do a better job of making that choice.
Yeah.
To get married and to have the kids and get the information you need. And don't just rely on that relationship DUI.
Yep.
And, the passion, the hormones and love. It's not about love. It's about behavior.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I agree with you. That's a long way to say, yeah, you're right.
Right. Well, I mean, because when you're dating somebody, you're putting your best foot forward. It's almost, you're selling yourself to that individual. You're trying to make them like you. You want them to be interested in you. You want to give them a good impression. You're on your best behavior.
Yeah.
You might not you're not going to be on your best behavior, 5 or 10 years down the road when you're really tired and there's a screaming baby and you haven't slept in 5 days and it feels like the house is on fire. Right.
And you're stressed to the max. Yep. And, the money is in short supply. You don't have enough time. I mean, there's all these things you have to think about. How do we react to stress?
Yep.
How do we react to lack of sleep? Things like that, because that will happen. That's what will happen.
Yep.
The takeaway is, if you're going to move in with each other, make it relationship focused.
Yes.
Not event driven. So it's relationship driven, not event driven.
Yes. We want to move in together because we are ready to commit and we want to make a go of this for lifelong.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So next week, we are going to talk about clinical depression. So the title of the episode is going to be, Am I Clinically Depressed? So we're going to have a special guest on. This is Dr. Arpan Wagre, and he is the CEO of Providence Wellbeing Trust. He is a psychiatrist, and we're going to talk about the difference between situational depression and clinical depression. And we're also going to get into advocating for your own mental health with your doctor, because that's where it starts, is with your primary care provider. So we will see you all next week.
Have a good week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.